Hello, everyone, and welcome again to another Come Let Us Reason Together podcast. I'm excited today to be joined by my friend and my special guest, Jana Harmon. Jana has made an interesting ministry in talking with those who are not atheists. They're Christians, but they've come from atheism. And she's kind of doing a forensic ministry, if we will, trying to understand the atheist mindset, understand those things that draw people to Jesus, especially in our 21st century secular culture, and just seeing how the other side ticks. And I think it's a fascinating idea. I think it's a fascinating ministry. And we're going to learn about what convinces the atheist to once again believe in God. On this, Come Let Us Reason Together. Welcome again, everyone. As I said, this is Lenny Esposito. I'm glad to be joined with a wonderful friend of mine, Jana Harmon, Dr. Jana Harmon of Side B Stories, who has, as I said, made it her mission, at least currently, to investigate and talk with a wide array of individuals who didn't believe in God, didn't believe in Jesus, didn't believe in the Christian message, but then came to faith. And it's a fascinating approach to apologetics by kind of taking a forensic approach to it, trying to deconstruct, if you will, their gaining of faith, as opposed to what we normally hear, deconstructing the loss of faith. So, Jana, first of all, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your ministry and how you came about on doing these kinds of things.
Well, thank you, Lenny, for having me on. I'm just very honored and privileged to come and talk about this, I think, very exciting work. I am married, live in Atlanta. We're empty nesters, except for a golden retriever who keeps us busy. But other than that, I enjoy, as you say, speaking with former atheists and skeptics and bringing their stories to light and understanding why and how they came to accept Christ and become passionate followers of Him. I became interested in this question, what would it take for an atheist to become a Christian? Because, as you know, the work at Biola is amazing, and I graduated there with a degree in Christian apologetics, and I was very convinced by the cumulative case of the Christian worldview that is very compelling, it's convincing, intellectually, existentially. It seems to explain reality in the best means and terms, and I was utterly convinced of it after I went through that program. Over the next 10 years, in watching apologetics from a more practical perspective, I would watch these debates and arguments and read, the atheistic side and then the Christian side. And it seemed that conversations were like two ships passing in the night. It seemed like there was no impasse that no matter what we presented to the atheists, it seemed to make no difference. And so it was just a natural response for me to think, well, if the rational argument is not convincing, what would it take for someone to become open to another perspective or another worldview? And so that question prompted a research journey through my doctoral program, where I interviewed 50 former atheists, and they presented their perspectives on a survey, and I listened to their stories. As you say, I love that, how you describe it in a forensic way. I wanted to look at all the pieces of the puzzle in terms of why it is that they accepted atheism as a worldview. Was it purely rational? Did it have something to do with their upbringing or their experience or their desires? Because we're whole people and we make decisions and form beliefs for more than just rational reasons. So I wanted to take a look at how they formed their atheistic beliefs, how they became open to another perspective and why they did, and what brought them on into belief in Jesus Christ. Christ. So it's an amazing study. And so I was able to, at the end of the day, say, not only ask the question, what would it take for an atheist to become a Christian, but more clearly, what did it take?
Well, that's awesome, and it is interesting that people don't think about it in those terms. They don't want to, we all hear ideas of testimony, right? You tell me your testimony, and we're pleased with that, but to come at it kind of systematically, I thought was kind of a nice move, a brilliant move. And what are some of the things that you've learned from it? Tell me. What's been interesting in this journey?
Oh my. That is a that is a big, wide open question. I think, well, there's a few things I would say from the get-go about that are just very prominent in what I found. The first is, I think one of the most extraordinary things that I found is that these people who were very adamant in their resistance against God are some of the most passionate followers of Christ now. Um, of the 50 that I interviewed for my research, and I've interviewed over 100 altogether, including my podcast, many of them are heavily invested in ministry and apologetics and continued learning, either if not on a full-time level and a part-time level. They're very, very active about their faith. They had to give up a lot to change their worldview in such a dramatic way, but they found life that's truly life. And it's not only that they have embraced it, but they want everyone else to embrace it as well. So I would say that this is a very strong group of believers because they know what it means to live on both sides without Christ and with Christ. I would say another thing that was, especially as an apologist, and I know you'll appreciate this, Lenny, oftentimes, we think as apologists that if we just give someone the right evidence or arguments, that it'll make a difference. For the most part, it seemed that the primary reason for turning towards openness away from atheism towards another point of view that's not necessarily Christianity at the beginning, but they are looking for something more in their life existentially. They find something that's good, or they meet a Christian, or something that makes the taint of God and Christianity fade. That there's so many barriers, and we think that they're all intellectual, but they're not.
Yeah.
And so when we understand that someone is coming at faith and looking for more from a more personal, subjective, human need or level, we can approach our evangelism in a different way. Yes, we need to know the answers and why things are true, and that the Christian worldview, matches with reality. But we need to consider the whole of a person when we're, wanting them or trying to engage with them towards faith.
I think that's a huge point. I think that's something that's really important, because we in the West have always fragmented and compartmentalized things. That's just, logically, aspirationally, we categorize things, and we have your work hat and your home hat and your reasons for this and your idea for that, and everything seems to be in separate little boxes. But people really aren't built that way. And even though they would claim that, it's reason and evidence are the only things that I believe, there's actually some emotional issues there. There are some relational pieces that you have to deal with. And Christianity is a holistic faith. It wants your heart, soul, mind, and all of your might. Jesus wants all of that. And we miss that sometimes, thinking that we can just argue someone into the faith. I got to tell you this one story. I was doing an online support for a crusade. So these would be people who would be watching the stream and coming in and asking questions. And I got individual who started saying, I want to believe, I really want to believe, but I can't. And I said, well, why can't you believe? What's the problem? And he says, well, I've got intellectual doubts. I have the problem of evil and things. I said, well, what do you do? I mean, that strikes me. His language was very sophisticated. So one of the things he said, well, I can't because, I'm a professor of philosophy and my philosophical training this leads me in another direction. So I started talking to him a little bit. And I said, well, your doubt, it sounds very Humean, right? Your objections are very Humean. And I don't know if anybody else who would have been volunteered would have even understood these kinds of things. But luckily, I got the professor of philosophy. So I started responding to him. And the most fascinating thing happened. The more I started showing how the problem of evil and the objections actually could be overcome intellectually, I could feel that he was getting more entrenched in his position. And it was, I really believe it was the Holy Spirit who tapped me on the shoulder and says, you know what's happening right now, don't you? He said, what you're doing is you're threatening the last 20 years of this person's existence. He spent a lifetime building up his philosophical career. And by trying to tell him he's doing poor philosophy, you're not going to sway him. You're actually building up a wall by presenting that evidence. And the Spirit said, you need to switch tactics. And said, well, you said you want to believe. Why then do you want to believe? And then it was the emotional side. I feel empty. I feel alone. As you say, the existential crisis. I think James White does a good job in that in his Worldviews book, talking about how that will lead to a nihilistic understanding. And it was just a fascinating experience, because what it does is it teaches you that it's not the intellect that's really the thing that might be the string, might be the trigger. We use reason and rationality, and if you're appropriate, even if you're an Antony Flew, you can do it well and maybe say, I have to follow the evidence wherever it leads. But most people don't realize how biased their understanding is and what they hear versus what they are willing to receive. And I'm even in a conversation with a gentleman right now whose level of demand for evidence for God is something that's incredulous. It's way outside the scope of what you would consider normal evidence for the belief of the existence of any being in any other context. And so I'm thinking that you're seeing that same kind of thing when you're talking with these folks.
Oh, absolutely. One of the most interesting questions I think that was on the survey is they were supposed to put themselves back in their shoes of an atheist. And I said, what were your primary reasons for believing in atheism or that there was no God? And there were a number of things that they could select, whether they were rational, or intellectual or otherwise. And so they gave, their responses. And of course, it was mostly rational responses why they didn't believe. And then I asked the question on the survey, as a Christian looking back, what were the real reasons for your atheism? And it was interesting because the subjective or the personal became a lot more prominent than they were willing to admit as atheists. Yeah, the rational and the intellectual is certainly a part of it, especially like for your philosophy professor friend, who that is his identity. It's his vocation. He has believed and promoted a certain worldview for a long period of time. So you have to believe that there is some kind of pride might not be the best word, but there's a sense in which he's right.
Well, it's his self-image, right? I mean, his self-image is built around
identity,
that. Yeah.
Right? And that's usually the tip of the iceberg there, because the will. I have a chapter in my book called "If There's Not a Will, There's Not a Way." And some people will dance around a lot of different and through expressing a lot of intellectual doubt, but it really is the tip of the iceberg of what's going on underneath. Like there was a guy I remember, I think he expressed it very clearly for him. He's like, I had genuine intellectual doubts, but I had insincere motives. I wanted to live in the way that I wanted to live.
That's a
I
great
didn't
quote.
want, yeah, I didn't want to have to get, I didn't want to have to buy into this, in a worldview where there was a sense of accountability or, of course that was just for him. There might have, there may be another interesting thing that I found is when I asked those questions, what was the primary reason for not believing in God? The most prominent reason was personal or subjective reasons for disbelief, and that was 62%. So they were willing to admit on some personal level, no matter what informed that, whether it was bad experience at home, bad experience with Christians, just didn't want it, wanted to live their own life, or maybe it was, an absent God. We know that the hiddenness of God is a major source of, disbelief or stated disbelief because, where was God? Why didn't he show up? Those kinds of things. So there are a lot of emotional issues tied to disbelief. I think it, what, what got me really started about all this is when I was trying to tease through we're more than just rational creatures is when I was reading Blaise Pascal, of course, who speaks of the passions informing the reason. And that he said most people invariably arrive at their beliefs not as a matter of proof, but as what they find attractive. So our desires can drive our beliefs. And again, I would just want to reemphasize that Tim Muehlhoff of Biola says it well. He says our beliefs are wrapped up in a story of how we got there and why we believe what we believe. So we have to really, as we've been talking about here, think about people more holistically. And because none of us come to believe for sheerly rational reasons, there's a lot more going on to the story.
Yeah, I agree. Your one instance reminds me of Thomas Nagel, who's another very famous philosopher who has actually written a book. 2012, he wrote a book, Mind and Cosmos, while the neo-Darwinian model is almost certainly wrong. And he has said in other areas that, he doesn't know where consciousness comes from. He can't explain it in materialist terms. He would almost explain it with a belief in God, but he was honest enough to say, my actions, I don't want there to be a God like that. I can't believe in God because I don't want to be basically beholden to an entity morally. And that's very, very true. Now, another sociologist, Paul Vitz, I don't know if you are familiar with Paul Vitz.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote a small book called The Faith of the Fatherless, where he looked at many different atheists throughout, who are normally famous individuals, some who are former atheists. He included C.S. Lewis in this, but he looks at Voltaire, he looks at others, and he says, almost to a person, what he finds in these cases is that they had some kind of problematic relationship with their father or their father figure, that there was an issue there. And he says one of the biggest problems we see in modern society basically is people will project their poor relationship with their biological father onto God. Did that ever come up in any of your interviews?
Yes, absolutely. I think Paul Vitz's work is very good, and I think he does. I think he's onto something there. When someone experiences a physically or emotionally absent father, whether they're at the hands of abuse or those kinds of things, sometimes, of course, we can get a warped view of who our earthly father is, and so it projects onto the heavenly Father. And so there's a lot of research around this from a psychological perspective, not only Paul Vitz, but in my speaking with those 50 former atheists, there were definitely stories where that was true. I'll give you a couple short examples. One was, let's say one was a Christian who actually believed in believed in God. Their family was very dedicated. The father was a deacon at the church. He was taught Bible studies on Sunday. They were pretty solid until his father abandoned the family for an affair and left the family for 7 years. And of course, that was, for the young man who was a teenager at the time, he believed that God would care for them, that God was real, that, that the solid Christian family was in place and it was God's design. And then here his father, who he trusted, abandoned him, and he abandoned God, the son at that time. And it took several years for him to consider return. He was so emotionally wounded from that. Or it could be, for example, there was a bad home situation where a young man grew up as a twin, and his brother was always favored, and he was, according to his story, tremendously abused. And he was an alcoholic father. He was never valued by his father, and always felt unloved. And then he had some other bad things happen in his life, sexual abuse from a neighbor. And so when all that happened, he said, life got very dark for me. There's no way, he said, a God could exist when all of these bad things are happening in my life. And so, I could list for you, I think there were 14 out of 50, that's 28%, who actually said on survey that their troubled relationship with their father contributed to their atheism. So it's important to know and to recognize and appreciate that earthly relationship can have a devastating effect on how someone sees God. But I want to say, because sometimes when you read a book like Paul Vitz, and his premise is good, it's solid, but you can't apply that to everyone. So we need to be careful, just like James Spiegel, has this thesis that all atheists are immoral. Well, um, again, when I looked at their data and their own perspectives and their desires and the way they saw themselves in their lives, many were troubled by the immorality of atheism. And that was a point of tension for them, because they were so moral, they just couldn't ground it. They knew things were wrong. So
it's true technically, in the sense that you're immoral the way we're all sinners.
Yes. But not all atheists live depraved lives. That's what I want to say. It's, in that kind of sense. Yes, we're all broken, we're all sinners, and yes, we're all immoral in kind of a generalized sense. But sometimes I think atheists are portrayed in a certain way. And I think we need to be careful not to broad brush everyone. Just because you meet an atheist doesn't mean that they've had a sad, horrible life or a bad father, relationship. What I've learned actually is some were very happy and contented in their atheism. They didn't want God to be true, kind of like Tom Nagel, fine on their own, don't need God, happy family, solid, relationships and upbringing, had no, they essentially had no need for God, because everything was going so well. So what I want to say here is that we need to appreciate, just like no Christians are actually alike, and we don't all come to our beliefs in the same way. And, we have different issues at home and struggles that may cause us to lean towards God or not. So we need to appreciate the fact that atheists are individuals, and they each come with their own story and their own uniqueness, and that we need to be very, very conscientious about not just coming at them with a preconceived notion of I know who you are and I know why you don't believe, because that is really that's overstepping, and that's a naive perspective, because I think we need to appreciate the individuals for who they are and why they came to the belief. So like, Tim Muehlhoff recommends, just you start with, tell me your story,
Right.
find out who they are, get to know them.
Yeah, it's amazing
before presuming.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
amazing what the question of why do you believe what you believe will bring out in people,
Yes.
because uh, I've told the story before of a Jehovah's Witness that was asked at my door. We start debating, Jesus as God, and I said, wait a minute, there's a lot of faiths out there. Have you always been a Jehovah's Witness? And she said, no. I said, well, why are you Jehovah's Witness now? And she tells me this story of how she had an older brother who had a mental disability. He was born with it. Several years her senior. She loved the brother, of course, as a young woman, but he would also act out because of this mental impairment, causing him to do things that she said were like morally reprehensible. Eventually, in his early 30s, he succumbed his life because of this issue. And it began her to wonder, I know my brother can't be in heaven because of the things that he did, but I can't picture him being in hell. So she says, I started a spiritual search, and 2 years later, I found the truth in the Jehovah's Witnesses. Well, the Jehovah's Witnesses don't believe in hell. They believe in annihilationism, right? So if I'm going to argue Granville Sharp's rule of Greek grammar on whether Jesus is, the God, is that really where I should be spending my time talking to this individual? Or should I be switching my approach to start talking about that the Lord will meet us where we are and forgiveness is available? And by asking those questions, I think you're right. I think it's really important. Let me ask you something else, though, because you said a couple of things that I thought were really interesting. First of all, because fatherlessness does play a part, or at least poor father relations plays a part in this, and we're seeing in our society a marked increase in fatherless families today. The stats are actually really scary. It's no surprise that we see depression rates going up. There's other reasons for that as well, and the facade of social media and the grand ideology that it creates, that's not true, is part of that. But it worries me that you would see a rise in nuns. Well, it shouldn't be surprising if we see this same fragmentation in family. But similarly, our culture is very affluent today. You don't have to worry about whether you're going to have a full stomach. And I talk to a lot of people where I talk about we live in an era of the conceit of affluence, where we just assume, and this happens both, as you say, if Christians think that there's some kind of silver bullet that all they have to do is say this and you'll believe, or people are just being obstinate and they're, it may not be that simple. But it also happens on the left where people think, well, all you got to do is give somebody money and they'll live their life gloriously and things like that. And again, people are not that simple. They're not wired in that direction. So as you've continued your conversations, have you noticed any shifts in the way people have come to either their atheism and or their belief in God than you would have maybe when you first started this journey?
Yeah, I'm with you, Lenny. Everything that you say is so true. I think the way that we used to consider apologetics, say with the new atheists, and it was more rational and just pull out your best argument. The world and the culture has changed dramatically since then, as you know. It is very very different in terms of familial stability. We're seeing brokenness in the homes, fatherlessness increasing. We're seeing, deaths of despair and anxiety and depression rates off the roof. Um, and in addition to that, I mean, if somebody is really in a place of despair, you don't want to throw an intellectual argument their way. That would mean nothing, and in fact, may be even offensive to them at the moment, because you're not really paying attention to what's going on with that individual and what's the most important thing to them at the moment. Which is maybe health or healing or some kind of emotional comfort or even just finding simple purpose in their life. There's so much that's gone on culturally. Again, we have moved to this place of well, let's just say Christianity isn't real plausible anymore. Christianity and conservatives, and particularly evangelicals, have been painted as intolerant and bigoted. And so it's become very unattractive. So, or something not good. So you're working against that. You're working against the fact that they're with this lack of exposure, because people are separating, we're living in a very polarized society. So people want to get in their own tribe, and it's us versus them mentality, and these stark lines are drawn. And so there's a lot less direct exposure to Christians or Christianity or authentic or genuine forms of it. And so we're getting these messages culturally, whether it's coming through social media or those little slogans that came out or that come out consistently, or, again, painting the other as something bad or evil, or, something that you don't want. And so while yet there's this personal despair, they're getting more messages towards, as Carl Trueman would say, promotion of expressive individualism. And it's, we've lost that sense of objective truth. We're coming to subjective truth, and I make truth, and I know what's best, and we become our own gods. And so the needs and the way of even looking at something like religious truth has really been compromised, I would say. And so, and then you add into that all the, again, you touched on it earlier, the public deconversions, and then, the press or the media will bring forward everything that's bad or compromised about the church, or, some kind of religious leader, gone bad. So there's all these things in the water that are stirring around, that are so much more elevated than they were 10 years ago. So that people are separating themselves away from conservative religious beliefs, belief in God, because again, people want to do what they want to do, and they're believing the slogans without thoughtful investigation. So it's a really challenging time in some ways, but not in others. I would say the challenging because of the walls and the barriers that are being built in this us-them kind of culture and society, but yet real opportunity because of the increasing brokenness that we're seeing around us. So I think it's a real opportunity for Christians to actually cross the barrier, as it were, and engage in the lives of those who are hurting and broken. I will say, you mentioned, you asked me at the very beginning what was, a prominent feature, or something that I found that was very interesting. And I found this, and a recent researcher, Joel Furches, has found the same thing, and that is, in the vast majority of former atheists who become Christians, there is the presence or the engagement or the interaction of a Christian in their life. In my research, 82% had some encounter with a Christian. For Joel, it was 70% of 32 stories that he read had some encounter, some direct engagement with a Christian who was able to show them that Christianity isn't all the negative stereotypes that they think that it is, that we're actually normal people who live pretty good lives, lives of love and joy and satisfaction and fulfillment. Of course, we don't have perfect lives, but also so we can show them what an embodied, authentic faith looks like that makes it attractive, but also we can be in their lives to show, not only show them that there is a better way, but actually minister to them in ways that, relationally we can see their need, and we can minister to them in ways that break down those walls between us, and they can see that perhaps belief in God and Christ, there's something attractive or good about that.
Yeah, I think Rodney Stark made the point. I've mentioned it in prior discussions about how when there was a huge plague that broke out in ancient Rome about AD 160. And it literally decimated the Roman army. About 1 out of every 10 Roman soldiers were wiped out. It was mostly prevalent in the major metropolitan centers because of the close contact and the poor hygiene. So in the city of Rome itself, you had much of the aristocracy leaving town. And if you had an uncle who had the plague, you just left him. And you went to your country villa where the air is supposedly better, right? And as they were traveling out, the Christians were coming in. And did Christians die? Did they some of them catch the plague? Absolutely, some of them did. But some of them recovered. They brought food. They brought care to those who were abandoned. And when those people recovered, guess what they did? They became Christians because, hey, you went to pray to Juno and Jupiter and Mars, and you left me here to die. And these guys came in. And so he says that that's one of the reasons why in the late 2nd century, early 3rd century, Christianity really started to explode, even though it was a persecuted faith. It's because the selflessness of the Christian community that acted on these things. Similarly, the Christians did the same thing, of course, with the abandoned children on the Tiber River and things like that. Christianity was always understood to be, again, the hands and feet of Jesus, who would touch the 10 lepers, even though 9 of them don't come back. It's only the one who comes back and says thank you. But that's a part of it. And again, in our society today, we want the argument, but do we want to spend the time? Because the time is really, really important. So
yeah, time is important. And just to give you kind of a follow-up, the young man that I was telling you about earlier, the twin who was treated poorly by his emotionally abusive father and then was sexually abused and then became an atheist. You can imagine when someone's in that kind of emotional hurt and pain, you have to think what would breach the armored wall that he had built, this anti-theist kind of thing that he had going. And it's interesting because for him, of course, it wasn't an intellectual argument. He was so angry as a teenager. He found wrestling as an outlet to expend his pent-up anger and pain. And he found himself wrestling harder and, bigger and stronger young men until he really outdid himself and found himself on the mat with a broken neck. And so it put him in the hospital. But he had this Christian nurse who would come and say, I'm going to pray for you. And he said, I don't believe in God. And she would say a prayer. And then she would say, I'm going to read the Bible over you. And he said, I don't believe it. And she would read. And he said, she was just so kind. He said it was off-putting, but still, she was just so kind. And then he just started saying one thing after another, whether it was a family member or the church ministering to his family in their circumstance. They started going to that church. And then there was a youth minister who seriously invested in him as a father would in the absence of his own father. A youth minister who would come and see him play basketball or take him for a ride or take him out for to get a Coke and just listen to him and value him. And it drew him in to Christ. And so I think we don't understand the power of valuing the other and loving the other in such a way that sometimes that is the door. And oftentimes it is the door that opens towards someone to go, okay, this is good. I see this is good. Now, is it true? And that was generally the path, is that someone saw something perhaps missing in their life, or they met a Christian that looked like they had a different life, and they become all of a sudden interested and curious because it was attractive in some way, and then they went on a pursuit to see whether or not it was true. So apologetics played its role. It just wasn't the first part that happened in terms of their openness, generally speaking. Now, there are those I must hasten to add that there are those who are, just about the intellectual argument. We're up for an intellectual challenge, found more than they bargained for, that kind of thing. But yeah, again, we have, they say the Lord says, well, they'll know us by our love. And that it's amazing how I think we're valuing that more and more, especially in this broken culture. I just don't think that we think about that enough, especially as apologists.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
want to approach it a different way.
What are we impoverished with in today's society? And it is real relationships. I mean, everybody can do, pseudo relationships online, and those aren't real tangible relationships. But real relationships are really that which we have a stark poverty over, and it's becoming more and more clear. So if you can provide some of that, I think that is a big goal. Can I ask you? Can I ask you before and then I'll let you talk?
Yes.
What was the breakdown of say male versus female in the folks that you've talked with?
Yes, it's predominant. It's about 2/3 male and about 1/3 female. Although I do believe that the number of female atheists is growing. But if you look demographically at who is an atheist in Western culture, it is predominantly young, white, male, who's liberally progressive, urban. Generally speaking, that's the profile.
I mean, that's kind of what I thought, but I was curious to see if there was something maybe beyond that. So, do you think the atheists understood the gospel? I mean, a lot of times they say they do, but do you think they really encapsulated or really had a clear understanding of what that entailed?
That is a really, really good question, Lenny. I think that, how can I say this the best? That oftentimes they destroy what they don't want to believe. They deconstruct Christianity, dismissing it almost out of hand. They'll throw out they would throw out slogans. There's a presumption, a cultural and intellectual presumption that atheism is true. And so that there was not much need to look very closely at what Christianity is, who Jesus Christ is, what the Bible says. They had been tutored, in a sense, by, online chatter, or they heard, just a statement by their intellectual authorities in education, like science, here's science. One person capsulated it this way. Here's science, here's religion, science wins. So maybe that might be all someone needs to think to themselves from an identity perspective. I'm intelligent. I want to be with the intelligent people. I don't want to believe superstition. There was a very, again, negative hue towards Christians as being uneducated, deluded, weak-minded people who needed a crutch. And sometimes those slogans were enough to convince somebody, I don't want to be that. I'm over here from an identity perspective. And of course, intellectual, educated people believe in a naturalistic worldview, and they just presumed, again, or from the people around them or whatever, they presume what's true without a real thoughtful investigation. And what's even more interesting is not only is there a presumed dismissal of Christianity without a thorough look, there's also oftentimes an embracing of atheism with really not understanding the fullness of what they're embracing. What does it mean to have or to believe that the natural world is all there is? Well, that means that there's a lot of consequences that follow from that idea. A loss of self, even a loss of, how you understand consciousness, a loss of free will, a loss of objective morality, a loss of so many things that they just didn't really, many of them didn't really truly appreciate the fullness of even what they were believing or embracing in their own worldview, much less in the other.
Yeah, love just becomes a biological construct in order to spread your genes to future generations. The love isn't real, and of course, beauty evaporates completely.
Right,
So
right, right. Yeah, and it's hard to live that way. There were a few who really understood their worldview deeply because 7 of them were PhDs. Nearly half had held graduate degrees. So these were people who thought critically. Again, some were informed of their own worldview, some were not. Most were not informed of Christianity.
okay, well that's great. Oh, so what's next for you? Now you've written a book. So to tell everyone about your book and that it's out, and although it's an academic title, which means that it might run a little bit high, but people can still get it. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, it's called Atheist Finding God. And it's really a condensed version of my doctoral work. I tried to make it very accessible and for a general audience. What I wanted to show was basically the stories of naturalistic atheism and Christianity, and what it would take to convert from one worldview or story to another. And I mean story in the most robust sense. We believe that Christianity is the story that matches with
The
reality, that
grand
it is
narrative, yeah.
it is the true story of reality. And then I I go through the book just kind of like I went through my research. Is okay, why are atheists atheists? How did they view their life? Why did they become atheists? And then what was it for me? This was the $1,000,000 question. What was it that allowed an atheist to become open to another perspective or another point of view, or even consider anything outside of atheism? And I go through that. And how did they go on a quest or a search towards God? What was their conversion like? How did all of these influences work together? The intellectual, the spiritual, the social influences in our life, the experiences. How did they inform our beliefs and changes of beliefs? I tried to look at everything from a very holistic perspective, and then look at their transformation of life afterwards. And so I tried also to really capture the voice of these former atheists. So I used a lot of their words, the way that they thought, the way that they felt, their own perceptions of their views, and even some of their stories, so that whoever that reads it, I hope, will get an idea and a sense of what it did take for atheists to become a Christian, and look at it from a very holistic, again, perspective, so that we can, my heart for this book, and actually for this work, is for atheists and non-believers to know Christ. Um, and I want to help us as Christians remove the barriers and become more effective in our engagement. From an apologetic perspective, and I mean that from an existential way as well as intellectual way, and through our lives and our thinking, just how to approach uh, the non-believer or the skeptic. And since then, I have I I host a podcast produced by the C.S. Lewis Institute, where every other week we bring forward a former atheist or skeptic who not only tells their story. I interview them and they tell their story. They walk us through all of those things, why they were an atheist, how they became a Christian. But at the end of every podcast, they also give advice to the curious skeptic as to how to take next steps towards God or belief, to investigate that or to search that out for themselves. And they also give advice to Christians on how best to engage with non-believers. So the work that I'm doing now, and we're working on actually getting those stories out to countries in different languages now. So it's very exciting.
So if you had a family member, a friend who says, I've got this coworker, I've got a neighbor, I've got a schoolmate who's just, we like each other, but he's always on me about this religion thing. He says he's an atheist. What would be the first thing that you would tell someone to say or to do with a situation like that? How do you counsel Christians who come up to you and say, please help me?
Right. No, that's a great question. There are a lot of different things that I've learned. And I think we talked about it. We touched on it. The first thing I would say is just be in relationship with someone. I don't think we value or we pursue the other intentionally enough. Just being in someone's life, to not only show them what a Christian life looks like, but to be there when um, when what I call a disruption or a catalyst occurs in someone's life. I mean, someone could care less about God. They may care less today, but they may care tomorrow or next week or next year or in 5 or 10 years. And you're going to be the person in their life when something happens in their lives where they become interested, whether it's a crisis or a change or meaninglessness or some kind of, there's all different reasons why someone might become open, but you were the one who was there. And being relationally present and patient, I would say, are very important. It's also important to be prepared so that when, I think as apologists, we're called to have good reasons for the hope that we have for the gospel, for our faith, and not only listening to who the person is, like we said, just engage in a, not with okay, have you thought about this and that and this and that? Why don't you start even relationally getting to know their story? Tell me about how you grew up. I'd love to know why you think you do the way you do and how you established those beliefs, and what you think. What do you think about a religion and God? Just start asking open-ended questions that are not threatening to them and not threatening, where you don't have to, bear some burden of proof to prove this or that, but you're just engaging and valuing who they are, getting to know them, getting to know those reasons below the tip of the iceberg without pressure and in a genuine way. I mean, I think that people can always tell if they're a project. We don't want people to be projects. We're investing because we genuinely love them. I would also recommend prayer. Prayer is incredibly important. I just interviewed someone 2 days ago, and he said prayer. He said there's no other way to explain it other than prayer, because his wife had started becoming a Christian. He was adamant against Christ and God and anything to do with religion. And he said, and that's what his big emphasis was. He said, I know this would not have happened without prayer. But also being prepared when the hard questions do come, that we understand our own worldview well, and we get to know their worldview and what the implications are of that, and understanding how to really ask the important questions that might help them see the weaknesses in their own worldview, help them to see, like, without God, there is no meaning. There is no real right and wrong.
Right.
So just kind of, because when we are knowledgeable, we're not there to win the argument. We're there to help them see that what they're looking for, what their heart desires, they can't find in their own worldview. But look over here. We have that. I mean, God has that. God, and we have the fullness of joy and satisfaction and meaning. And we have everything that the culture is longing for now. There's so much emptiness. And we can help them discover in a way that's not confrontational, although there are those who are driven by confrontation too, I tell you. Um, they're going to prove us wrong no matter what. And then they find something so utterly different than they thought they were finding. I would also say introduce the Bible. I can't tell you how many people, they were going to disprove the Christianity, and they opened the Bible. A lot of people dismiss the Bible, as this old, antiquated, horrible book, with a moral monster, but yet they've never read it for themselves. And I can't tell you how many stories I have of people who actually opened it and were completely blown away by what they found, that Jesus was completely different than they thought he was, that, Christianity was completely different. And sometimes the word is just so powerful, it's on its own. I guess that's a few things.
Okay,
I think
so
I could recommend.
so if I were to sum this up, it's persistence, it's patience, it's prayer,
Presence,
it's
being present,
personal, relational, and then preparedness. Yeah, that's
yes.
So that would be kind of how you would want to approach it. Always doing everything through, as you say, scriptures, and pointing them to the Word of God, which I think is wonderful.
And right, and of course, conversion is a hard issue. It's the Lord who works in people's hearts. So I really want to emphasize this. It's not about us, or it's really what the Lord is doing in and through them, and using us to participate in his work. So.
Right. Absolutely. So one other question, just the folks that you've talked to, now that they are believers, what do they say now? I mean, you said that they're usually very engaged, but how has their life changed in tangible ways? I mean, you talked about that they had to give up a lot. I normally think about this with Mormons, Muslims, where you have to basically forego all those traditions, all those family in total, right? A lot of Islamic families will disown people. Mm-hmm. The atheist probably has to give up his group of friends, his peers, and things like that. But what else do they experience after that?
Yeah. It is true of atheists too. About a third of them said that they really had to leave all of their relationships behind because they were no longer accepted in their social groups and things like that. But I will say another big challenge for the atheists or the former atheists is just I guess you could say, moving from a place where they were the captain of their own ship, and really adjusting to a very, very new paradigm in terms of God being ultimate authority, and that things had to be different in their lives. The changes there were a bit challenging. But in terms of really, when you speak with a former atheist, you can almost sense the palpable difference that Christ has made in their lives, from real darkness to life. And it impacts every area of their life. I remember there's a woman on my podcast. Her name is Adrienne Johnson. And she was, I guess, if you could call, there are stereotypes of Christians, there are stereotypes of atheists. She was probably your stereotypical atheist, tatted up, self-destructive behavior. She didn't want God. She was running from God and searching for life everywhere except for God. Even the relationships that she had, she would just self-sabotage. I mean, she was just in a really horrible place. And but you look at her now, and she is full of light, full of love. She ironically, she works in a conservative political forum and promotes conservative ideals and objective truth and reality. But she met a man at church, and they are like two peas in a pod, and she has this very stable relationship and her marriage and her life, her outlook, everything has changed. And it's hard to deny that the radical difference that Christ has made in their lives, not only hers, but so many. Just like the guy that I interviewed 2 days ago, he looks like he belongs in the band ZZ Top, but instead of, raging against God, he actually is working full time in ministry, in an apologetics ministry, where he goes and meets, with kids, and he's in 5 camps this summer, and he's, making audio and video recordings. It was just, I think his apologetics TV show was just nominated for an Emmy. And you go, how in the world did that happen? But only God. That's all I can say is only God. The transformation in so many of these lives, I mean, it's just remarkable. Of course, the Christian life isn't perfect, and all is not sunshine and, lollipops, but for the most part, it's just an extremely different outlook, identity, purpose, a self-value, relationships, the way that they see themselves and others. Everything has changed.
Wow, I think that's a great way to kind of sum up our conversation. That's the hope that we have, and it's the true power of the gospel to change lives, which is wonderful. Again, sidebstories.com is your website. So if people want to listen to the podcast, see, I'm sad that I can never be on your podcast. So I had to invite you to mine, because otherwise we can't have a conversation.
Yes.
But all that is to say, though, it's wonderful. We see each other at conferences from time to time, get to hang out and have lunch and things like that, which is always great. And if I'm ever in Atlanta again, I get there from every once in a while. We'll go out and have a good time together as well, I'm sure. But thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming. Anything you'd like to say at the end before we leave?
No, Lenny, I just appreciate the time that you've given me to talk about it. I think these stories are so compelling, and they're so insightful. I think if we would just listen to these former atheists themselves, we can gain so much in terms of understanding and knowing how the Lord works in so many different ways, and that we can, I think, be inspired not only in our own journeys, but also how to really be effective in our ministries with people who don't believe. It's just completely transformed my life, and I know that everyone who listens to each one of these stories, there's so much to gain, and I would really encourage you to listen, just listen to them. It's amazing.
How effective when they go out to evangelize other atheists? What is the reaction that they get? Because, it's a little different when you're saying, hey, I was in your shoes.
Yeah, that's a really good question that I haven't asked of. I mean, when I hear them speak of their evangelism, they don't talk necessarily in terms of being focused towards just former atheists and skeptics, but I can't imagine that they wouldn't get a more close listen by the skeptic, because they were there. They would understand, and I think that they themselves would be the most effective evangelist and apologist, because they understand and can really stand in the shoes of the former skeptic and say, I understand. I know where you are, and I know what you think. In a sense, again, no one's identical, but they, I think, can be the best ambassadors for the former atheist or skeptic, or for the atheist or skeptic, because they've been there.
Okay, well, again, Jana, thank you so much. Always a pleasure talking to you. And I hope your ministry continues to just grow and explode. It's wonderful being here. So thank you.
Thanks so much for having me, Lenny. It's just been a real privilege and pleasure.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. That was Jana Harmon from sidebstories.com, and fascinating discussion. I hope you enjoyed it. Hey, if you have questions or comments, let me know. You could leave them below in this video or write to us at comereason.org. And this is Lenny Esposito. We'll be talking to you next time. Thank you for watching this Come Reason video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more videos like these, consider subscribing to our Come Reason YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button. And you can follow us on social media. Lastly, if you'd like to help keep these kinds of videos free, consider providing a donation by clicking on the donation button beside me. Thank you.